there was a difference actually in tenderness between, I want to point out tenderness between the pigs that received the diet early and the diet late, but not the control was not different between either two.
Hello, meat folks. Welcome back to the MeatsPad podcast. It is your happiest host, Phil Bass, and we have with us Jay Stowater. Jay, did I say your last name correct? Yes. Okay. Jay is a dynamic individual doing some research currently at Iowa State University, and I'll have you talk a little bit about that. You also have your own cattle company, and so maybe we can sell some cattle for you here.
Hopefully you can.
Okay. But your research is currently in pigs, is that right?
Yes, it is.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So my project for that, my research focused on examined feeding anhydrous calcium chloride at a dietary 3% inclusion rate in both the early and late finishing stage of production. Also had a controlled diet in there. This is for allowing pigs to stay on feed during times of supply chain disruption, also during possibly foreign animal disease outbreaks, allowing pigs to stay on feed, buying some time, slowing down their growth, and preventing depopulation events and heavy economic losses to the industry.
So we had some precedents set recently during the COVID times, and oftentimes adversity breeds innovation. And so is this a result of some of that?
Yeah, so this is some follow-up research that was started during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Nick Gabler, one of his students, and some other researchers looked at various strategies to hold pigs on their growth, to slow down growth. And one of the strategies they developed and looked at was feeding anhydrous calcium chlorides. The first trial they looked at had a 2% and a 4%, and that was just examining some strategies. And they had a 3% and looked at how it affected pork quality. So it was an effective means of slowing growth.
So first off, maybe can you tell us a little bit about what anhydrous calcium chloride is and how that slows their growth, and then maybe we'll get into some of the results.
Yeah, so anhydrous calcium chloride is an acetogenic salt, and it has it impacts in the diet, slowing down growth as far as decreased appetite, and the pigs weren't as efficient on this diet. And they also, because this was an ad libitum diet, they weren't restricted at all on how much they were fed. They could have as much as they want. They just did not eat. Their intake was lower and their efficiency was lower. There's been some research that's looked at possibly some metabolic acidosis and how that's impacted, the efficiency of converting feed.
Okay. Well, and let's give. I want to give the listeners a little bit of a background, and if you're less familiar, it's obvious to our listeners out there who are meat processors. There was a backlog of animals during the COVID-19 pandemic when we were trying to figure out how to get these plants back online. And the reality is we have livestock that are ready to go just about every day, and it's hard to just say pause. It's hard to put them in a holding pattern. And so it seems as if this particular ingredient in the ration was an idea of putting them in that holding pattern. So they weren't necessarily getting much more fatter. They were just kind of maintaining their weights. Is that right?
Well, in terms of gaining weight, the pigs we looked at had a slower growth rate. Now, the pigs that were originally looked at during the COVID-19 pandemic, they almost had their growth just completely stopped in their tracks during the late finishing stage. But it does buy some time as far as more time on allowing them stay on feed, if we have a supply chain backlog. Now, if you have pigs that are following up behind them, it does not deal with that issue.
Doesn't fix everything.
Doesn't
right?
fix
No,
everything.
This is a Band-Aid.
It's part of the solution. We have to figure out some other ways in the industry to be more adaptable to these kind of situations.
Right. Okay, so tell us a little bit about what you found. What were some of the results in the study?
So we found that feeding at the early and late finishing stages is effective at slowing down growth. Now, in this case, we did not see the dramatic impacts to pork quality that the earlier study had seen in the late finishing stage. We did not see a difference in, for example, pH, or we did not see a difference in color. And these pigs, now I will say this, these pigs were not a terminal line of pigs. These were a more maternal line pigs, so not heavily selected for in terms of a lot of carcass traits. Okay. So, and these pigs were also fed in smaller pens than the other group, but again, growth was slowed down. The pigs at both instances, the early and late finishing, finished at lower finishing weights of the trial, and there was a difference actually in tenderness between. I want to point out tenderness between the pigs that received the diet early and the diet late, but the control was not different between either two. So the pigs that had the diet earlier were more tender than the pigs that had the diet later. And I think there's still some, I won't dive completely into that. I just wanted to share that as far as the results.
Well, I think we need to dive just a little bit if you're okay with that. What do you think was going on there?
I think there is possibly some mechanisms that need to be looked into as far as, the Lonergan lab does a lot of proteomic work. And we did not do any proteomic work in this case, but I think there is some future work to be done in that arena. So,
well, we know that calcium, it does influence tenderness later on post-mortem, and so that'd be interesting to look a little further into. Did you look at marbling at all?
Yeah, we looked at marbling, and there was no difference in marbling. We also did lipid analysis as far as we used the CEM, homogenized pork loins and pork loin chops, and did NIR using the CEM, and we found that there was not a difference in marbling in this particular line of pigs.
And I know that the listeners out there are, for those in the pork world, are probably wondering how the bellies turn out.
So we did have some other research on the bellies. We just looked at the loins. We still haven't found out a lot about the bellies yet, but there's some collaborators that are working on that. But we just looked at the fresh pork loins for my portion of the study. But certainly the bellies, that's a major part of the pork chain today and needs to be looked at. So that's, again, we focus just specifically on the loins in this case.
That's all right. Yeah. Well, that'll give us opportunity to follow up in a future episode, I'm hoping. Absolutely. Yeah. So it sounds like it was an effective means of putting the animals into a holding pattern, but didn't have a huge impact on overall quality of the meat.
Absolutely.
Okay. Was there a big yield difference?
No difference in yield or dressing percentage.
Really?
Yep. No difference in yield or dressing percentage. And even though the finishing weights were different, so there were, differences obviously with the size of the pigs, differences in their loin eye and the back fat depth they had. So,
okay. Well, this is all fascinating, and like I said, it leads to some additional conversation in the future. Which once we find out who those collaborators might be, we want to maybe see how that does affect the belly. It is a significant value portion of the pig carcass. But let's hear a little bit about you. We always like to ask our guests, how'd you get to where you are? How'd you get involved in the meat sciences, Jay?
Well, I grew up in a cattle family, actually, with cattle feeding and then cow-calf operation as well. And I knew I wanted to do something in the meat and livestock industry is in the general rule. And I have an uncle who at one time suggested that I'd look into doing something in meat science. I had a great professor in an undergrad, Stephen Lonergan, who's now my major professor, who came to me and said he liked the way I thought and how I always asked a lot of interesting questions in class. And I liked the fresh meat side of it. I had an internship, several internships actually, one at a large commercial feedlot in Nebraska, another with the certified Piedmontese beef, and then I also did some research summer internship with Dr. Stephen Shackelford at Clay Center, Nebraska at US Mark. So there's been a little bit of a journey to get here, but I've enjoyed the journey.
Jay, you're not old enough to have accomplished all of that stuff. That is so cool to hear. And I say that in jest, of course. But yeah, you've definitely dove head first into the meat sciences, and it'll be fun to see where this takes you. What are your plans for the future?
So once I finish my master's, I intend to get a job in the industry, in the livestock industry, meat industry, probably actually in the either beef or swine, doing some kind of work that ties both the live and meat side of the industry together. So improving producers' bottom line and ultimately consumer satisfaction with eating the great protein we produce.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is definitely a noble goal. It's something that I am often working on, is just trying to make that connection back to the producer that what they're making is meat. It's not a finished pig or a weaned steer. It's meat ultimately. And so if we can make that connection, especially someone like you helping make that connection in the industry, the future looks bright. So
thank you. Yeah, it's certainly, we intend to eat all of the ones we produce, and whether it be pigs, cattle, chickens, there's turkeys. There's certainly a need for the bridge between the producer and what they produce that goes on to feed the world.
Absolutely. Well, and your research has demonstrated that in case we do need to put these animals into a holding pattern, these pigs into a holding pattern, that it's not going to necessarily affect the overall quality or the yield percentage on those pigs. And so thank you so much for doing this research.
Well, thank you for having me on today and joining us here at RMC. So.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Jay.